to Lab 37, and this is where we take the kids when they come for field trips, and they go into the labs mysteriously to do classes, squid dissection, crab lab. You'll hear them talking about crab races, which is a different class. But it involves crabs, but it's more the process of science. So they're testing hypotheses and how to use crabs. So this class that I kind of modified for you all is called the Crab Lab class, and we're actually not teaching it for the K-12 students anymore because it just takes a long time to get all the crabs together that we need. But it's a fun way to kind of explore the taxonomy of crabs. And one of the things we ask when we just get the group together for the first time is like sort of what do you already know. So what kinds of relatives of crabs can you think of or name?
Lobster?
Lobster, yep, they're relatives of crabs.
Spiders?
Spiders, yeah, so there's it depends on like how closely related we're talking. You've heard a lot about taxonomy with Ralph and Bill, and so I don't know, I wasn't sitting in on both of theirs, but everyone has their own mnemonic about how to say kings play chess on fine green silk. That's what I learned. Class, order, and even, you know, there's a lot of reorganization on taxonomy, so I'm not going to go too heavily on that, but that's one of the focuses that we kind of talk about in this class. Not too heavy on the terminology because it's always rearranged, but basically, relatives of crab depends on how big a group you're talking about. So they're animals, yes, and they're in the phylum Arthropoda. And arthropods all have something in common. They have jointed, which is arthro, and pod is legs, so they're jointed legs. And asking the kids about that, like, where do you hear that word arthro? They put the R in there. Arthropoda. So, and that's a huge phylum. There's like 80% of the described species of animals that we know of are in this phylum. That's a huge group. So we're not going to talk about all arthropods. We're going to focus it down a little bit and mostly talk about crustaceans in this class, which is a subphylum. It's not like next to the next level, but in between phylum and class. And so if you think of, now there's lots of different ways to talk about taxonomy, and usually it's the branching tree. This is just sort of a different way of exploring it, especially with students. This big circle of this big group of arthropods, some of them are crustaceans. So arthropods, 1.1 million described species. Crustaceans are about 70 or 67,000 described species. And they're a subgroup within this arthropod group. And this is not to scale. This is just sort of generally visualizing these groups. And our crustaceans have certain things in common. They have the jointed legs, which makes sense because all crustaceans are arthropods. They all have paired appendages. So that means, like we have a pair of arms, pair of legs. You'll notice the crustaceans we're checking out today generally have paired appendages in most of their life cycle. They'll have the exoskeleton. And we talked about that with Mitch and others, that they have to molt that exoskeleton to grow. So I've got some pictures here, and I actually think Mitch had this in his slideshow. But the process for that, if you're getting too big, your meat is getting up right next to that exoskeleton, it keeps you nice and protected. You have to get bigger, so you have to get rid of this shell, and grow a new shell. And so the process is when they're ready to molt, it separates. They're taking their whole body out of the back of the shell, and it's soft at that point, and then the molt is left behind. And the ways to tell the difference between a molt crab and a dead crab, what are some of the ways that we talked about in the last group? How it's split, right. So how it splits, if you're a molted crab carapace, got that nice wide split here. If you're a dead crab, it's much more narrow. So if you're on the beach and you find a carapace, and you can see that'll give you a hint as to whether you're looking at a molted animal or a dead animal. Looking at the eyes can be helpful too. If the eye stalks are clear, cloudy white, it's probably molt. If they're black, then there's an eyeball in there. Because usually when they're molting, the eyeballs come with. And so you only see the outside. And of course, if you can peek inside, there's nothing in there, then it's a molt. It's very lightweight, blows off your hand when you're standing on the beach. And if it stinks and it's heavy, it's probably dead crab. And so after the animal comes out and it's soft, now my dad's family lived in Baltimore, Maryland when he grew up, and they have blue crabs out there. Has anyone ever had a soft crab sandwich? Right. So if that's very vulnerable during that time when you're a soft crab, and they'll take those crabs, harvest them, put them right on the sandwich, eat the whole thing, exoskeleton and all. And it's perfect sandwich size. But during that time, you're vulnerable. So when Mitch was showing you a picture of all the crabs molting at the same time, a simultaneous molt, that's a pretty good strategy. If everyone's molting at the same time, you're kind of flooding the market with soft, vulnerable animals, and so maybe predators will eat your neighbor who's also soft instead of targeting it on you, the one vulnerable creature. So it's kind of a good strategy. And during this time when they're soft, they're going to suck water into their bodies so that their new exterior surface will make a new shell, will become crusty over the next few days, and then there will be room between the meat and the new shell, and that water can be replaced by meat as the animal grows. So that's why I was saying at certain times of year there's not a lot of meat underneath the shell. We're waiting for them to grow into their shell before they're harvested. So all these crustaceans have exoskeletons. They have 2 eyes, they have antennae, sensory organs. So given this information for the crustaceans, you have a lot of animals on your table. Just take a minute or two with your group and find which things are on your table are crustaceans and why. And there might be something on your table that is not a crustacean. See if you can find it. So talk amongst yourselves either way. Sometimes you can see the eyes. It's kind of could be either way. And that it's sometimes hard to appreciate all of these characteristics, but you can mostly appreciate the exoskeleton on these, the paired appendages if they haven't broken off, the jointed legs and such. Most of you were right in saying that the muscle here on which the barnacles are living are not arthropods, they are mollusks. So soft-bodied inside a shell, in this case 2 shells. So they're a completely different phylum. They're not arthropods, let alone crustaceans. But the animals living on top, the barnacles, are they crustaceans? Can you see their lovely jointed legs? No, because it's like low tide. This is a tide pool, and here it's warm, and there's all these pokey predators, and it's dry. So in order to appreciate the jointed legs of the barnacle, we kind of have to go a little closer into their life cycle. So within our crustaceans, we've got crabs and shrimp, which we're going to be talking a lot about more. And then there's barnacles and copepods, which are included in this group of crustaceans. And it's helpful to look at the barnacle life cycle to appreciate things like paired appendages. The Nautilus larvae here, when they come out of their egg form, they got these little paired appendages. And even when they metamorphose to the cyprid larval form, now they look even a little bit more like a shrimp, with its legs down and their jointed appendages and such. When they have a planktonic stage after coming out of the egg and going through these metamorphic larval stages, when they're ready to settle down and be adults, they have to find a good spot. They're going to spend the rest of their lives like a mussel shell or a rock or someplace that's going to keep them where they want to be. And then they glue their heads to that spot and build this nice volcano-shaped shell around them to protect themselves. And all those lovely legs and parts are inside that acorn barnacle shell, so you can't really appreciate it at low tide. But this is what it would look like if we could get them to come out. So if you would take your barnacles and put them in this dish of water here, with salt, cold water. Also, we have some food that our barnacles would like to eat because they use these jointed appendages to reach up and grab plankton and bring them down into their body cavities and stomach to digest. And this is the stalked barnacle, like the pelagic barnacles or gooseneck barnacles. So similar idea, just a little different body shape. So these plankton, are also crustaceans. Can you appreciate their jointed appendages? No, they're too small. So I will show you them under the microscope as you're feeding your barnacles. And you happen to be feeding your mussels too. We won't talk about that.
They're up there.
Any action?
Oh, there we go. Let me work there, Cait.
Animation in the rocks, purple. So down here, you're going to have your sea stars that really like to be wet all the time, and your urchins. And then up here in the middle zone, you'll have more of your mussels and barnacles on top of them. But then at the tippity top in the splash zone, that's where the barnacles can hang out. But they're pretty tolerant compared to a lot of these other typal species to desiccation. They can be out of the water for a while. Not to say that they want to be out for a long time. They still would like that tide to come back.
What, days or hours?
Hours, I think, because every 6 hours you have the tide changing. So they're expecting you to get some moisture, maybe days, because not the tide doesn't always go up the same height. You could do an experiment on that, see how long it takes. Our barnacles here are underwater all the time, so they get a little lazy. So they may not be as hungry as we'd like them to be. But what you expect to see, basically the barnacle is glued to a rock or a mussel or something with cement that it makes itself. And if you look at that cement under a microscope, it's like it's like a fibrous mass that's very strong. And scientists are very interested in how an animal can glue underwater. That's always a handy thing to be able to mimic for our own engineering purposes, and then the strength of that. But it's what a great adaptation to have your head inside this mountain of shell. And when the water comes up and there's plankton to eat, then it's time you can stick out your feathery legs, you grab the food, looks like a big eyelash, and bring it down into your body. If some little fish comes and eats off your legs, not a big deal. You can molt and regenerate your legs over time. But if you had your head sticking out, ready to eat the plankton, and some little fish came over and eat your head off, that's the end of the story for you. So, great adaptation from the barnacle world.
So they molt.
They molt because they're crustaceans.
So they have to get out that way when you walk.
So what you'll see is the top part will molt out and will come out the top. So then they're fragile. Each little cirrus, each little of these jointed legs, like an eyelash, has its own little exoskeleton. It'll slough off and it's hard to catch. But it has happened. You see little barnacle leg molts coming out the top. Yep.
What's the way to get the plankton? How do you draw back in there?
Yep.
Find the head and the mouth there?
Oh, let me get to it. So, and these are what they're eating, the plankton, which happen also to be crustaceans. These are brine shrimps, these are little parrot finches. Let me get back to the computer here. So here's the stomach, so it's going to grab the plankton and bring it down into its mouth area, and here's its mouth right here, down deep. So we can't really see it or appreciate it from where we are standing. But they grab the food and bring it down into the cavity.
What other legs have to get the plankton?
Well, they've got these little sensory structures on here to kind of give it a little bit more surface area. These top part comes out. Yes.
So the head stays down.
Yeah.
Just the legs work.
Yeah. So now we've talked about this giant group of arthropods, a subset which is crustaceans. Then we have the crabs and shrimp over here. This is where our barnacles are, and this is where those brine shrimp were, which are also crustaceans. So they're all different groups within this crustacean subphylum. But let's go into these crab and shrimp, and what we really think of when we're talking about crabs, the Malacostrata. And within that group are the decapods. What do you think decapods have in common? 10 legs, right, because deca is 10, pod is the legs, so 10 legs in this group. And that's a lot. That's crabs and lobsters and shrimp and crayfish. And so lots of diversity, and that's one thing I hope you come away with as we're getting through these animals. There's a lot of diversity in this group of crustaceans. We're going to start with the shrimp because you have a couple of shrimp on your either food trays. I don't have any mud shrimp today, but we do have the ghost shrimp. And first, before you go, get started, I want you to talk about the shrimp. See if you can find those 5 things that make it a crustacean. Touch the shrimp, see how it responds. These are burrowing shrimp, so they're living in the mud out in the estuary. They're not really used to being out here with a bunch of people poking them. But that might influence how they feel to you and how they act, how big their eyes are, if you can find them at all. And I put a male and female in the dish, so you have to figure out which is which. So go ahead and check out your burrowing shrimp. And I'm going to pass some stuff around while you're doing it. One of the classes is have people talk to each other about their ideas, and so you can kind of look for evidence on your own, and that helps with learning and remembering just the same way as when you're talking on the touch tanks about with people. And so to kind of, I've been talking with most of the groups one-on-one, but to sum up what we were talking about, you've been having ghost shrimp at your tables. There's males and there's females. They're both burrowing. They eat detritus, dead decaying stuff in the estuary that's come down from the land, in the river, in the mud. They have pretty small mouth parts, very small eyes, because there's nothing to look at when you're under the mud all the time. The female has one claw in the front that's slightly larger than the other. And there's a guide on your table if you're not sure whether you have a male or female. She also has an extra set of pleopods right under her abdomen, but those are for holding on to the eggs in case when she's ready to have the eggs and hold on to them, she'll keep them there for a while, so she needs those extra pleopods for that. The male has one claw that's ridiculously larger than the other and lacks those pleopods that would be for holding eggs if you're a female. So this sexual dimorphism, there's lots of good questions about why that might be the case, and there's lots of things you can think about in terms of other animals in the animal kingdom, why males and females look different. Is it to defend, to fight, to show off like a peacock? And so in the case of the burrowing shrimp or the ghost shrimp, that big claw is more of a show-off function. Because, boy, if you could put all your energy into this giant claw just to look good, we wouldn't be very fit. You must have awesome genes, and you would want to be a good partner for a female.
They don't fight.
But they don't.
It's not
Well, they might. You know, we've noticed that they fall off really easily. So it's also, and it twitches. You know, after it's escaped, it's sitting there with its claw, right? So there's other reasons to have a nice, giant, lovely claw. But if that makes you lovely and looking attractive, why not have 2 big claws? Really? Why are there no males with 2 gigantic claws? Yeah, and 2 is overkill, right? How are you going to dig through a hole and feed yourself with these 2 ginormous claws? So selection goes for, and did you think it was on the right claw, left claw?
Right and left.
And the female has a slightly larger claw. So, you know, there's ways you can answer some of these questions. You can jump up and look at everyone else's male and see if it's a right claw or left claw, and if it makes a difference. So, the other story here is this is a mud shrimp, which is a little bit larger and a little bit further out in the mud than the ghost shrimp, and I don't have one for you today. But Ralph can tell you all about the mud shrimp and its parasitic isopod. Now, this isopod is not this size. It's actually the size of an M&M, and it fits right into that brachial cavity of the mud shrimp and feeds off its blood supply, causing not the host to die necessarily, but to be weakened so they can no longer reproduce, which is not so good for this individual. What's interesting is that this particular isopod is an invasive species from Asia who just showed up and is infesting a large percent of this population. And if a large percent of the population of mud shrimp are infested with this sterilizing isopod, what is that going to do to the population? Already, many estuaries up and down the west coast have experienced extinction events for the mud shrimp. And there are lots of groups here at Hatfield studying what's happening to our mud shrimp. The ghost shrimp also sometimes are infested with a parasitic isopod, but it's a native species. It's not from Asia, so they co-evolve together. And I believe it's much lower rates of infestation. From Asia. Asia they came from. Yes. And this is yet another crustacean. So this is a symbiotic relationship, but it's an example of parasitism. So it's not mutualism like an anemone and a clownfish doing great things for each other by the relationship. This is one is gaining and the other is losing. And the decapods, this is where our shrimp are. 10 legs. Anybody count the legs to see if they were 10? And the isopod is where that parasite is, like a pill bug. There's lots of terrestrial forms of isopods. They're both in that Malacus strata. Now we're going to move on to crabs finally. Oh, good. Crabs. And there can kind of be broken into true crabs and false crabs. So that's the kind of way we'll talk about them. And we'll start with the true crabs. And examples are the ones that you thought of all along, like the Dungeness that Mitch was talking about all along, the Pacific rock crab, the red rock crab. So here's our red rock crab. And this one here is a shield crab. And you guys have, I think you can pass it around. Shield crab, like a kelp crab. Here's one. This is the kelp crab. So you see its carapace looks like a sort of police badge, sort of, or a shield. And what you can tell from, you know that they're arthropods because they have jointed legs. You know that they're crustaceans because they have an exoskeleton, jointed appendages, pair of eyes, antennae. What was the other thing? Then something else, eyes, yeah. And we know they're decapods because they have 10 legs. They've got these 2 claws in the front and then 4 walking legs on each side. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 is missing, but it still counts because they can grow at that. 10. And so what I'd like to do is bring you a kind of small example of a true crab, and that would be a shore crab. So take your papers off your table because it might get wet, or put some things onto your orange tray so you have lots of table space. I'd like to bring you a true crab called the shore crab. There's purple shore crabs, there's yellow, or sometimes they're called green shore crabs. When you get it, feel it. How does it feel compared to those shrimp you just touched? How does it act? How does it shape? And how does it move around your table? Because they can come out of the water for a short period of time. Count its legs. Show evidence that there's actually 10 legs in that decapod. And if you, let me give you a primer on holding a crab. Their claws are smaller than something that could really bother you too much. Their claws are in the front. I like to hold them on the back. I don't hold them by their legs because their little legs could fall off. So I hold them kind of by their back corner. You could hold them like this, but see how I can get my finger now with the claw? So that hurts. Ow! You can put them on the table, and he'll walk around. Please don't let him fall off the table. If you're nervous about a crab and you're afraid he's going to walk off the table, you can cover him with a towel. And that'll slow him down so that you can pick him up again. So notice how he moves around the table. And if it's a male or female, who remembers male and female? How to tell? I'm not even going to tell. You can't tell me. It's pretty obvious in this species, and there's no confusion. So get to know these crabs. If you're done playing with the crabs, it's eventually going to go in with your barnacles. Check your barnacles before you put the crab in. All right. So I'm going to give you one purple and one yellow. Out. Whoa!
Yeah. Lady. This one.
I know, they're just frisky. Hermit crabs. All right. If you look on the bottom on the stomach thing.
Copy that.
I don't know if they vary by season. I usually do that in the summer, so I don't know.
Yeah,
Okay, so did everybody be able to point out some characteristics of crustaceans with your crab? Anybody count the legs?
Yeah.
Yeah. Anybody find a number greater than 10? No, that's okay. Less than 10 is okay if you can see where they're supposed to be. And with their successive molts, they could regenerate those limbs. Although, and it's not really good to have their limbs fall off. So we try and keep their limbs on as much as possible. And so they've got 5 legs on each side. They have a nice carapace on the top. And you'll notice that they're kind of flattened top to bottom. How do they move on your table?
Sideways.
Sideways, same side, left side, right side, doesn't matter? Doesn't matter. So, but these kinds of questions you can ask and answer for yourself right there. Did any of them interact with your orange tray? What'd they do? Hide under it, yeah. So when they come to the orange tray, typically they back up under that lip so that the only thing out is the big claws. And then they'll just go sideways, so their back end is protected. So how cool is it to be nice and flat and top to bottom, big claws out in the front? These are the kinds of crabs you'll find out on the jetty rocks and on the in the tidal areas where there's lots of rocks. They're out in the open. They're hiding under the rockweed even when the tide is out and active. They have to stay moist waiting for the tide to come in. But they have to defend themselves. How did their exoskeleton feel compared to the shrimp? A lot harder. The shrimp are usually buried in the sand all the time in the mud. Nobody's poking at them usually. I mean, it's there, but you could squish a shrimp pretty easily. These guys are really used to being out with the rocks and the crashing waves, and so that hard exoskeleton is funny for them. And I brought around the bigger crab. I don't have any market dungeonettes, but after today, you're all going to run to the store or out to get your crab nets and just want to eat crab tonight, I'm sure. It's a nice little salad. And we talked about already the male versus female. Clearly in the shore crabs, it's a lot easier to tell. In some of the other species, it's a little more difficult. I want to bring around false crab for you now. Now, they're still decapods. They still have 10 legs. You can't count them all because the last pair, or sometimes the last 2 pairs, are modified. And that's the case of the hermit crab. The hermit crab has got its uropod, this soft back end, stuck in the shell of a gastropod, a snail, that is dead, long gone, but the shell is left behind. And they find the shell. They don't create this gastropod mollusk shell. They find it, they stick their uropod in, and then they drag it around with them for some extra protection. If they're nervous about something, they can tuck their whole body inside if the shell's big enough. And then they can come out when they're feeling brave and drag it around with them, using just these front appendages to walk around and defend themselves and gather food. So when we bring around the hermit crab, count their legs, see if you can find the differences. Think about how this animal is going to molt its exoskeleton. And the neat thing about hermit crabs, the experiments that have been done about what kind of shell is an awesome shell for a hermit crab, it's all in the ganglion of the hermit crab's mind. It's hard to know. They've done experiments where they take a shell, an empty shell of a snail, and a hermit crab, and they put it in a tank. And the hermit crab has a shell already, but he sees a new shell, he takes it off, he goes and climbs into the new shell. And the experimenter takes the crab and its new shell and its old shell out, waits 5 minutes, puts them back in. The crab walks up, woo, new shell, takes off his shell, puts in the new one, take the experiment out, 5 minutes, put it back in. 19 times this particular. And then you'll see crabs like fighting over the lamest, smallest little shell possible. And you don't know what they're thinking, but it makes sense to them. So when you get your crab, let it run around the table. I'm going to bring you around some other things.
I got 3 on this side.
Yeah, I do too. Can you see it okay?
He's going to head for the...
I'm gonna hide in the tray. When he was
That's why.
He'll go away. Go away.
Other ones.
I see 2 on only this side.
Yeah, that's all I see, yeah. Well, yeah, his two claws are up here, he's got this. With for the shell. Yeah.
So we have some dried crabs to talk to you about, but also some live crabs. And now we are armed with knowledge where you can point to a crab and say, well, that is a true crab, or that is a false crab. And it's really still a crab. It's a false crab because it's an anomurin. It has those last modified legs. For some reason, like sticking its rear end into a shell in the case of a hermit crab. But sometimes it's for digging, like our little mole crab molts that you have. These are, you see these down on the beach in the surf line. They're like little body surfers of the ocean. Great for kids and grandchildren to spend hours trying to catch. So they're fat. They don't have the big chelopods in the front, the big claws. In fact, they're more football shaped so they can tumble through the water. And when they get to the sand where they want to be for a while, they dig with their back end down into the sand and use their front parts for getting food. As the water washes over, if it washes all the way over, they need to keep digging to hide. They do so quickly. But then when the next wave comes over, maybe they want to leave and tumble around to the next spot and then dig in there and feed. So their back end is modified for all that back end digging. So they can keep their front parts out for feeding. So this is another example of an anomurin. We can't really count its legs because these are just molts. Sometimes in the year we have live ones and that's really fun, but we didn't have any this time. So I'm going to bring you some other animals. I'm going to bring you a couple more crabs, discuss amongst yourselves how they are similar or different from each other, whether you think they're anomurins, the false crabs, or the brachymurins, the true crabs, and what their lifestyle might be like, because some of them feel different or have different body shapes. Where do you think they live? And then we'll kind of regroup. Sound good? All right. And if you're concerned about things falling off the table, there's always that water. You can put them in and you know they can't get out. They might argue with each other though.
Oh, yeah.
You want it on a contrast?
I just tried to get him to move a little bit. He's kind of playing dead. Oh,
What's the matter with this one? There. Gotta have them both work. Get your antennas out. So that's 1, 2, 3, and then the big one. So we have 10. And they move those antennas. They're kind of like feelers, aren't they? You know, I really don't like this.
I like them in cocktails.
Well, this is a very small crab cocktail then, huh? And what is are those eggs? The orange under there? They've got to be eggs, don't they?
They are.
Here he goes, heading for the tray.
Gonna hide
Stay
out.
on the table.
He's gonna put his butt in there for protection.
Is he? Do they all back in? I guess they all do, don't
Yes,
they?
they all
Rather than
do.
just
Maybe they do say keep an eye on.
yeah, back in rather than burying your head.
False, because 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. All you can count is 8. This is a king crab. I believe it's a blue king crab. We have a few of these in the other room up high. Somebody donated these to us, and all the kids are like, what's that? But they're not from around here. They're more in Alaska than in the waters. But the same body shape holds true. Carapace on top, the legs, the jointed appendages. You can see his eyes, antennae, and such. You guys have porcelain crabs, those little dark crabs with big claws in the front, good for defending territory. They're eating algae and plankton are coming by. They're living in a tide pool on the rocks, but those big claws help them defend their territory and help them cling and hold on if you had them holding on your finger. Porcelain crabs called because they're pretty delicate. The parts can fall off easily if you're not careful with them. And the other crab, the little pygmy rock crab, some of them were rabid. They didn't even having eggs, but they're makes it easy to tell. You know, was that a true crab or a false crab? That's true because you counted all 10 legs. How about this one? Yeah, this is a tanner crab, and sometimes in the market it's called snow crab. I think though there's a snow crab that's separate than a tanner crab, and they just call them all snow crab in the marketplace. So, let's see. Lunch is almost here, and so I don't want to go on. Well, they've got their gills.
I mean, this one's up on a tree on land.
Oh yeah, terrestrial crab. So coconut crab, this one says it's another kind of anamurin, so you can only count 8 of its legs. And it is a terrestrial crab, so, you know, I'm not sure how terrestrial crabs work. I know with our crabs in the tide pools, they have to stay moist. As long as their gills are moist, that's okay. They're bubbling out of the front, they're kind of stressed out. So they would like to be in cold, oxygenated water, or staying still, hiding under some cold rock reef. But the coconut crab, does anyone else know about terrestrial crabs?
I've seen land crabs. I used to live in Puerto Rico, they eat land crabs.
Yeah, so there are species that are terrestrial, that live on land.
So they're different.
So they just have a different way, and I'm not familiar with
So
that.
these things have water, how long? I mean,
For a tidal, you know, some of them do better than others. So the hermit crab can hide in its shell and stay moist and cool if it's in the right spot. If it's a hot sunny day, they might have better chosen to be in the water, as best they can. Because it's not like they're sealing down like a mollusk snail that can hang on for hours waiting for the tide to come back. So this is a box crab, and this kind of reminded me of the pygmy rock crab, the way it's dense and shaped. And their strategy isn't really necessarily to run in all directions, but kind of just to hold up in a ball and be like a rock and either be ignored or roll around and be tough in that situation. So their behavior is a lot different. This coconut crab is one of the larger crabs, the larger anamurins, and they are not found here. They're found in the South Pacific, but they can be like, 30-something inches across. And they like to eat coconuts, so they climb up the trees. And people like to eat coconut crabs. So the story that I've heard, who knows if it's true? The story that I've heard is that the coconut crab, the way to catch a coconut crab is you watch its behavior. You notice that it goes up to the top of the coconut trees, eating coconuts, doing its thing, comes back down, back end down. When it's at the bottom of the tree, it feels around with its back legs, feels the ground, the grasses. Oh, I must be at the bottom. Let's go, and crawls away. So if there's a coconut crab at the top of the tree and you want to catch it, some of the natives used to put grasses tied into the middle of the trunk. And that way, when the crab comes back down the trunk, feels, oh, grasses, must be at the bottom. Let's go. Knocks itself out. For these modern times, coconut crabs are best seen like on recycling bins, and they're like robber crabs, they like shiny things, and they take them back to their nests. That's kind of interesting too. But we don't have to deal with these in the Oregon coast. That's a South Pacific news. You can tell us about those when you're going to next week. So I'm hoping that after this today, you are able to appreciate the diversity of crabs, and have some hands-on experience in the different behaviors and shapes and males and females and all that sort of thing. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. There are maybe estimated 1/10 to 1/100th of the arthropods have yet to be discovered. Of arthropods. So that includes butterflies too. So you can go in any direction. Are you guys ready for lunch?